Our next speaker is Anita McBride. Mrs. McBride's White House service spans 2 decades and 3 administrations. She first started in the Reagan administration, I'm sure when she was a very, very young girl. And she was director of White House personnel under Presidents Reagan and George H.W. Bush. She has served in a variety of senior capacities throughout the U.S. government, including U.S. delegation to the United Nations, at the State Department, and at the White House. From 2005 to 2009, she served as the assistant to President George W. Bush and the chief of staff to First Lady Laura Bush. Please join me in welcoming Anita McBride.
Good morning. Thank you, Ambassador, for introducing me, and thank you, all of you, for inviting me to join you today. This is also my first time addressing this group, and I very humbly join a group of very distinguished leaders and experts who offer you far more in this dialogue of U.S.-Iranian relations than I do. I knew I would learn a lot here today, and I have. I thought I would give my remarks based on 3 points. 1, a very brief personal experience I had with Iran and Iranians. 2, to give encouragement to the strong women of Iran to stay strong. And 3, to give a message of hope to young people about the opportunities that await you when your country is free. It's important that you continually elevate the oppression and human rights abuses faced by the Iranian people to the highest levels of our government, to peoples of influence here, and to American journalists. In the time I have for my remarks, I thought I would give you a context of that experience that I had with Iran and Iranians. It was an eye-opener for me, and it came to define how I viewed the world, America's place in the world, and ultimately my career choices as an adult. I was a 20-year-old college junior studying abroad in Italy in 1979. I liked being an American foreign student, living in the country of my parents' birth, and having friends from different places around the world. Several fellow students were Iranian. We took some of the same classes. We explored the city of Florence together, and we became friends. Those of you in the audience that are first generation, like me, will know what I'm talking about when I say I lived in 2 worlds. I was an American first, and I was an Italian, as an added bonus, second, and I know Louis Freeh agrees with me on that. I was raised to be patriotic to this country while respecting the traditions and culture of the old country. To my family, it was the United States of America that provided opportunities to waves of poor, uneducated immigrants like them. And in their mind, that opportunity could not be found anywhere but here. That was my frame of reference as a child and as a young adult, and I thought I understood America's place in the world and that others viewed us the same way. Turns out I did not understand it at all. In November 1979, the Islamic Revolution in your country opened my eyes to the importance and the obligation I had to more fully appreciate and understand mine. My family was not political, but when they became citizens, they registered to vote. They never missed an election, but politics ended there. They were the classic immigrant family. Work hard, don't get on the wrong side of the law, and give your kids a better life than you had. Our neighbors were Lithuanians, Poles, Germans, Hungarians, and Czechoslovakians. From all this ethnic diversity, I became familiar with the term the Cold War and would hear how communist tactics of suspicion and intimidation prevented our neighbors from having contact with family who still lived in the Soviet Union. Living in Europe in 1979 put me closer to these isolated countries, and even at a young age, helped me understand more about the difference between people who live in freedom and those who don't. What was most disturbing during this time, however, was the experience of watching the American hostages being taken in Iran and the failed rescue attempt to get them out. It was second only to the shock of watching the American flag being burned by protesters in the university's courtyard, which was the students' response to this hostage situation. I was very confused and I was angry. And gradually I changed from being very uninterested in politics and my government to being a participant in the democratic system. When I returned home to the U.S. in 1980, it was very easy. All I did was register for the political party of my choice, walk in and volunteer for the political campaign of my choosing, and vote for who I wanted to. Of course, I had no idea that other people in other countries couldn't do that too. It's so hard for many Americans to appreciate the freedoms we have, and it's easy to take these liberties for granted when that's all you've ever known. We have an obligation to teach new generations of Americans about the value of our civic institutions and how we are so blessed to live on the right side of history. It's also important to teach them we have a moral obligation to stand with those who are still seeking freedom. As a young White House staffer in the 1980s, yes, and I was of legal age, and the early 1990s, I witnessed a very different kind of revolution. The wave of freedom that took over in Eastern Europe, where we saw joyous reunions between families and friends that had been separated for decades. I worked for and had as my example steadfast leaders who took bold steps to support these newly independent states and help them build democratic institutions so that they could elect their own leaders and learn how to govern themselves. Democracy-building institutions were established by President Reagan to help assemble experts in law, political party building, grassroots campaign and election operations, and private enterprise development. Experts in all these fields were dispatched to these new countries, providing the technical expertise to create democratic institutions under the rule of law. Those institutions still exist today, and they are ready to help a free Iran. Over time, I have come to appreciate more deeply what Presidents Reagan and Bush said back then. The desire for freedom does not have a homeland. It is in the human heart. It is universal, and it is inevitable. In 2009, I went to Afghanistan as an international election monitor with the International Republican Institute, one of those democracy institutions. I worked alongside monitors from Eastern Europe who had been trained by these very same organizations a decade ago. Now, they were the experts and technical advisors in Afghanistan as they began to write their constitution and elect leaders to their government. Their more recent experience with organizing free and fair elections was so valuable, and it served as a reminder that people care about freedom, and they want to help spread it to others. Contrast the fall of communism in Europe to the violent revolution in Iran in 1979, which did not allow for the kind of reconciliation and dialogue and transparency necessary to build a free society. Moderate forces mistakenly accepted this violence and the execution of opponents. The stage was set for future oppression. It happened rather quickly, and some of its first victims were women. When Iran's opposition movement brought millions of Iranians to the streets in the summer of 2009, demanding a free and fair vote in the presidential elections, the Iranian regime did not count on, nor did they care about, the world seeing the images of innocent, nonviolent protesters suffocated by the massive security presence in those streets, willing to use violence on its own people. Half of Iran's 70 million people are under 30, and half of the population are women. Over the last 6 months, the winds of change have arrived in the Arab region, and there too, it is the women and youth who are leading these movements. Repressive regimes like Iran, I don't have to tell you, survive on brutal tactics. But we have seen they collapse the instant their people cease to be fearful of speaking out. We need to put a spotlight on the leaders of this new wave of freedom and show how social media helps spark events in the Middle East. We need to draw lessons that could be applied to spreading freedom in other oppressed lands. This new generation understands the need for political diversity and economic opportunity, and they understand the role of social media and how it allows voices, all voices, to be heard. Today's technology is the key to their mobilization. At a recent conference hosted by the Bush Institute in Dallas, lessons from the Arab uprisings were examined. One journalist and writer who fled Iran years ago, Roya Hakakian, believes Iran remains ripe for revolution. She said all the eulogies for the Green Movement that she has read in the press don't address the fact that the circumstances that gave rise to the movement have not changed. One of the projects at the Bush Institute, the Freedom Collection, documents and archives stories of freedom fighters around the world. People like Václav Havel, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, and the Dalai Lama have deposited oral histories and papers in this collection. Nima Rashidan, an Iranian who fled his country after being imprisoned and who is now a cyber activist for democratic reform, has recently been interviewed for that collection. It is so disturbing to hear reports that young Iranians are being expelled from universities and their academic records expunged. Education is critical to a country's progress, and yet the regime further depletes and disillusions its young people. 60% of Iran's 3.5 million university students are women. Women have had a long history in Iran of being very strong activists. And an important standard by which the progress of a society can be measured is the women's status in that society. The question American women have to ask themselves is, why should they care about Iranian women? Over the last 10 years, we have paid more attention to places where freedoms do not exist because, in part, of the direct impact it has had on our own country. In my own work, I have spent the last 8 years helping women in Afghanistan restore their rightful place in post-Taliban society. It is extraordinarily difficult work, but these women are among the most courageous women I have ever met. And they do not want to be seen as victims. They want to be seen as the leaders that they are. I sincerely believe stability and progress in their country and in countries in the Arab region are directly linked to peace and security in mine. The terrorism of 9/11 forced Americans to examine their place in the world and understand more acutely that what happens abroad affects us at home, and that the spread of free societies makes our country more secure and makes the world more peaceful. For an impatient country such as ours, this may be the hardest thing for us to do. I hope our leaders will reinforce for us that we have to do what is right, and we have to do what is most difficult. Be patient. And I would add, we have to resist being isolationist. Free societies are not built in a day, and the institutes of freedom are built in fits and starts. Setbacks are extremely discouraging, but they are expected. The chances of success are far greater when the movement bringing about that change is nonviolent, and it has to come from within. The main impediment to any progress or success in Iran is the difficult, suspicious regime that refuses any democratic reforms. Iran was hijacked by extremist leaders with extremist ideologies that isolated their citizens, turned neighboring countries into enemies, and continue to destabilize the region and the world. We have to continue to use sanctions, spotlight regime abuses, and understand the leverage points that undermine authoritarian regimes, such as military loyalty, nonviolent resistance, social media, and economic decline. We also have to educate journalists about the realities in Iran. The president of Iran is a nobody. We know it's the Revolutionary Guard and the clergy that control the country, and the situation is unsustainable for them. The economic crisis is getting worse every day. Why should the citizens of a country so rich in gas and oil be facing this kind of hopelessness? Targeted sanctions should be imposed, and they should be tied directly to human rights. If human rights improve, sanctions can perhaps be lifted. And the pressure to stop nuclear program must continue. In the fledgling democracies in the region, we have to strengthen prospects for success by deepening commitments to ideas and policies favorable to freedom. None of this strong action or support is possible until we first revitalize the American commitment to fostering democracy and supporting freedom advocates around the world. That is what your message should be to our leaders. In closing, I would like to follow the example of my friend and former colleague, Fran Townsend, who, when she addressed this group, took the opportunity to speak directly to the young people of Iran, especially the women, that she was sure would be watching these proceedings through broadcasts. I thought about what words of encouragement that I could offer you. I decided I would share with you a little bit of history of U.S. engagement in Iran in the field of education. As chair of the Fulbright Foreign Scholarship Board, I see every day how educational opportunities are changing people's lives and helping to build nations. In 1949, an educational exchange agreement was signed between the U.S. and Iran. In the early 1950s, urgently needed manpower for industrial, educational, and governmental programs sent its most outstanding students to American and European universities. Between 1949 and 1979, over 1,000 U.S. and Iranian Fulbright grants were awarded. There were 51 U.S.-Iran university linkages focused on faculty development, English language training, and competency for Iranian students. In deference to my friend Governor Rendell, I want to cite an example about the decade of cooperation between one of our country's finest institutions, the University of Pennsylvania, and the University of Shiraz in Iran, where a pilot project helped provide advisors and faculty to work with Iranian professors and administrators to transform Shiraz University's structure. Fulbright Iran was small, but it was highly regarded and was the preferred educational exchange program. Educational exchanges were a major contributor to creating understanding between our two nations. For more than 30 years, we have had no Fulbright program in Iran, no educational exchanges, no international leadership exchange programs. These are opportunities that are extended to 155 nations in the world as of today, but not to Iran. Your country has the capacity to use enormously valuable resources to better your lives, but your leaders prevent you from having the kinds of opportunities young people in countries all over the world have. During the time Iran cut itself off from the world, Our International Leadership Exchange Program and the Fulbright Program developed future leaders of their countries, such as Nicolas Sarkozy of France, Tony Blair of Great Britain, Helen Clark, the former Prime Minister of New Zealand, Julia Gillard, the current Prime Minister of Australia, and the leaders of Chile, Mexico, Ghana, Austria, and the Czech Republic, Mongolia, India, and Poland are all alumni of these programs. The United States has powerful tools in our vast arsenal of diplomacy, and my hope is that they will one day be deployed to help a free and democratic Iran rebuild into the country you all want and we want for you. Thank you.